Minister for Communication.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to statute, I present a treaty document relating to the ratification of the final acts of the 2019 World Radio Communications Conference of the International Telecommunications Union. Mr. Speaker, I ask leave of the Parliament to make a statement in connection with the treaty document.
Is the leave granted? Minister, make your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I seek leave of Parliament to table the partial revision of the International Radio Regulations as incorporated in the final acts of the World Radio Communications Conference 2019 for ratification by this Honourable House. Mr. Speaker, the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies. The ITU allocates global radio spectrum and satellite orbits, develops technical standards, and works to improve access to information and communications technology worldwide. The ITU has 198 member states. The purposes of the ITU, which are laid out in Article 1 of its constitution, include maintaining and extending international cooperation between all members of the improvement and rational use of telecommunications of all kinds, including the radio frequency spectrum. The ITU Constitution and ITU Convention are the primary instruments of the ITU, and they set out the rights and obligations of member states of the ITU. Papua New Guinea has been a member state of the ITU since independence. The cooperative approach to international telecommunication issues facilitated by the ITU is beneficial to Papua New Guinea. The use of radio spectrum and its roles in today's technology-focused society has never been so important. Most of us make direct use of spectrum in our everyday lives when we use mobile smartphones, laptops, tablets, and when we watch television, which may receive signals from transmitters on the ground or from satellite that orbits the Earth. Outside these more familiar examples, radio spectrum is also used for many other purposes, including for aviation, maritime, and by the scientific community for the detection of emissions from space or from the Earth itself. The most important global spectrum harmonization activity are World Radio Communication Conferences, or WRCs. These conferences are held approximately every 3 to 4 years to review and revise the radio regulations and the regulatory framework generally for international spectrum management and take key decisions concerning the identification and international harmonization of spectrum bands. This framework is contained in the radio regulations. Papua New Guinea is a signatory to the ITU Convention, which is a treaty-level legal instrument that obliges PNG to comply with the radio regulations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the international framework for the management of the radio frequency spectrum is documented in the International Radio Regulations, or RRs, as published and maintained by the ITU. The RRs are a binding international instrument administered by the ITU under the Constitution and Convention of the ITU. These are part of an international treaty and determine the rights and obligations placed upon national administrations around the use of spectrum in their country relative to spectrum use in all other countries. Alongside this, the RRs also recognize the sovereign right of countries to manage and use spectrum within their borders the way they wish, subject to not causing interference to other countries' use. The RRs form an international treaty containing rules and coordination arrangements covering all the different uses of spectrum and are binding on member governments. The radio regulations set out mandatory technical, operational, and regulatory parameters and conditions of use for radio frequency spectrum and satellite orbits by communications technologies. This facilitates equitable access to and rational use of the radio frequency spectrum and satellite orbits. In essence, Papua New Guinea radio communication services must not cause interference to the services of other countries where those services operate in accordance with the radio regulations. Conversely, Papua New Guinea services are entitled to protection against interference from other countries as well. The RRs have, for many years, determined the pattern of spectrum use internationally. In many cases, it is necessary to do this at the international level in order to, one, avoid or keep international interference to a minimum, two, facilitate mobility and harmonization through the identification of global bands, especially important for terminal equipment such as mobile phones. Three, derive benefits from international markets for equipment with resulting economies of scale for operators and users. And five, recognize the international nature and interference management aspects of some radio services. For example, aeronautical, maritime, and satellite services all require spectrum to be available seamlessly across the nation. The purpose of the RR is to ensure that the rational, efficient, and equitable use of the radio frequency spectrum. In this respect, the RR contains allocations of over 40 radio communication services. They also provide technical, operational, and regulatory conditions for the use of the radio frequency spectrum and the geostationary satellite and non-geostationary satellite orbits. ITU members are required to ensure that the radio spectrum is used internationally in a manner that will prevent harmful interference to services. To ensure that the RRs facilitate the introduction of new technical advances, they are periodically reviewed and may be revised by the World Radio Communications Conference. Mr. Deputy Speaker, ITU held the last World Radio Conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, from the 28th of October to 22nd of November 2019. The National Information and Communication Technology Authority, NICTA, is in the exercise of its functions as mandated by Section 9C of the National Information Communications Technology Act 2009, represented the state at the World Radio Communications Conference 2019. NICTA was supported by industry experts. World Radio Communications Conference 19 considered an agenda of 23 items. This is considered a large number of agenda items and is a reflection of the complexity of the global radio communications environment, a complexity due in part of the rapid introduction of new technologies. Mr. Deputy Speaker, WRC 19 contained numerous changes to the radio regulations that are expected to support continuing development and rollout of communication services such as mobile broadband, intelligent transport systems, and scientific applications. Key decisions include wireless broadband connectivity. This covers spectrum allocations and regulatory provisions around communication systems that would predominantly deliver services to end users. This includes high-profile issues that have a significant citizen and customer interest, such as future spectrum for wireless broadband to support devices such as smartphones, tablet computers, and other associated consumer products. Satellite services. This covers spectrum allocations and regulatory provisions around satellite services. Satellite services are inherently international in nature and therefore are a matter of extensive discussions in every WRC. Transport. This covers spectrum used by transport-related applications. Many of these agenda items are of particular interest to the aviation and maritime sectors and the associated regulatory bodies in Papua New Guinea, that is the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, the National Maritime and Safety Authority, and the Department of Transport. These bodies have overarching responsibility to the regulation of the aviation and maritime sectors in our country. Scientific use of spectrum. Issues considered within this section include radio astronomy, which is the detection of naturally occurring radio emissions in space, and Earth exploration satellite, which is the use of radio spectrum for the purpose of mapping and imaging of the Earth's surface. Regulatory challenges introduced to facilitate rational, efficient, and economical use of radio frequencies and associated orbits, including the geostationary satellite orbit. Wi-Fi networks. Regulatory provisions revised to accommodate both indoor and outdoor usage and the growth in demand for wireless access systems. Intelligent Transport Systems, ITS, integrate ICTs in evolving ITS to connect vehicles, improve traffic management, and assist in safer driving. Broadcasting Satellite Services, BSS, protection of frequency assignments, providing a priority mechanism for developing countries to regain access to spectrum orbit resources. Global Maritime Distress and Safety Systems, GMDSS, expanded coverage by adding Iridium system and enhancing capabilities of GMDSS for maritime safety. Promoting gender equality. World Radio Conference 19 adopted a declaration that promotes gender equality, equity, and parity in the work of the ITU radio communication sector. The provision of additional allocations of frequency bands to existing and new radio communication services, improved procedures for frequency coordination of radio services, and a more appropriate operational parameter for spectrum licensing. Mr. Deputy Speaker, these key decisions are expected to intensify the development of broadband services, particularly mobile telephony services, facilitate new mobile satellite services, and provide a more flexible regulatory framework for use of the radio frequency spectrum. As Papua New Guinea can expect to see new technologies developed in overseas markets that can quickly be deployed within Papua New Guinea. Mr. Deputy Speaker, World Radio Communications Conference 19 will have an impact on the national spectrum management arrangements, in particular the update to the National Frequency Allocation Table, NFAT, managed by NICTA. The NFAT is a comprehensive source of information, provides key data on current and potential radio spectrum allocations in PNG, and aims to inform a diverse range of stakeholders, including current and potential users of radio spectrum. The RR provide an agreed framework of rights, obligations, and procedures applicable between countries in their many use of the radio frequency spectrum. However, in exercise of its sovereign rights, Papua New Guinea reserves the right to structure its national spectrum plans, including NFAT, to suit national requirements. The NFAT is intended to respond to Papua New Guinea's domestic radio spectrum requirements and consequently reflects national spectrum allocation and utilization policies developed through public consultation. Papua New Guinea's obligation under the radio regulations are implemented through the Papua New Guinea Radio Frequency Spectrum Plans, RSP, including the NDFAT, which is prepared by the National Information and Communication Technology Authority, NICTA, in accordance with the National ICT Act 2009. The existing RSP will be updated by NICTA to take account of the WRC-19. NICTA will also progressively reflect the new technical provisions in the management of the radio frequency spectrum in licenses granted under the National ICT Authority 2009. No amendments to the Act or regulations are anticipated or required. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the WRC-19 revision of the radio regulations entered into force on the 1st of January 2021. For a member that has not notified its consent by the 1st of 2021, the revisions will apply provisionally until the member notifies whether it consents to be bound and will enter into force for that state from the date it notifies its consent to be bound. If Papua New Guinea fails to notify its decision within a period of 36 months, that is by 1st January 2024, it will be deemed to have consented to be bound by the provisions Article 54 of the ITU Constitution. Ratification would be consistent with PNG's position at the conference. Conversely, failure to ratify these minor amendments is likely to reflect poorly on Papua New Guinea's standing within the ITU. Given that the current amendments are acceptable to Papua New Guinea, it is preferable that Papua New Guinea enters its ratification prior to the 1st of January 2024. If the amendments are not ratified, Papua New Guinea may be disadvantaged in the long run due to other countries not recognizing Papua New Guinea when coordinating satellites and frequency usage. This could potentially lead to interference to Papua New Guinea's existing satellite and terrestrial-based services. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Papua New Guinea derives its ongoing benefits from the ITU's work through such matters as the framework for international connectivity and development of standards for new telecommunication services. In addition, the radio spectrum management framework has enabled a high utilization of the radio spectrum in Papua New Guinea using standardized equipment sourced on world markets. The changes to the radio regulations are highly technical in nature and include additional allocations of selected frequency bands to radio communication services, improved procedures for coordination of radio services, and more appropriately, operational parameters for licensing. These are expected to intensify the development of broadband services, facilitate new mobile satellite services, and provide a more flexible regulatory framework for use of the radio frequency spectrum. As such, Papua New Guinea can expect to see new technologies developed in overseas markets that will quickly be deployed within Papua New Guinea. There are no perceived disadvantages to ratification. Changes to the radio regulations are of a technical nature and do not disadvantage Papua New Guinea in any way. However, their impact on Papua New Guinea and therefore National Information and Communication Technology Authority, NICTA, as the spectrum manager, pursuant to the National ICT Act 2009, need to ensure the National Allocation Frequency Table is updated and complies with treaty arrangements. PNG made a general reservation to the proposed final acts at the World Radio Communication 19. PNG reserved the right to take measures it might deem necessary to safeguard its interest if another member state fails to respect the conditions in the final acts, or if reservations made by any member state are prejudicial to radio communication services in Papua New Guinea or full sovereign rights. Most of the revisions from the WRC 19 apply to Papua New Guinea provisionally from 1st of January 2021 and would only formally enter into force if PNG notifies the Secretary General of the ITU of its consent to be bound, or if consent is deemed because PNG has failed to provide notification of its decision within 36 months by 1st January 2024. In accordance with the ITU Constitution, the general reservation made by Papua New Guinea would remain in force, provided that PNG maintains the reservation when notifying the Secretary General of its consent to be bound. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the proposed final acts contain the revisions to the radio regulations agreed at the WRC 19. The outcomes of the WRC 19 are consistent with the rational and efficient use of Papua New Guinea's sovereign assets in the radio frequency spectrum. The revisions agreed at the WRC 19 contain numerous changes to the radio regulations that are expected to benefit Papua New Guinea by supporting continued development and rollout of communication services. There is no disadvantage to Papua New Guinea consenting to the provisions to the radio regulations and taking the proposed treaty action. Papua New Guinea retains its sovereignty right to control transmissions within its territory and to protect Papua New Guinea users from interference from foreign systems. The principal benefits for Papua New Guinea arising from the revisions are the provision of more bandwidth supporting mobile broadband services, improved connectivity on aeroplanes and ships, increased global satellite broadband availability and competition in the non-geostationary satellite orbit market, expanded capacity and coverage, particularly in the provision of global maritime distress and safety system satellite services for maritime services, improved protection of radio science and access for developing countries to satellite orbits. International cooperation and radio communications promotes, enables conditions, including policy and regulatory certainty and interoperable technology standards for the efficient use of PNG sovereign assets in the radio spectrum. The WRC 19 revisions to the radio regulations are in Papua New Guinea's national interest, and it is recommended that binding treaty action be taken. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I commend the ratification of the final acts of the ITU WRC 19 to this Honorable House. Thank you.
The question is that the question be put. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. Ayes have it. Clerk.